In the Philippines, two worlds always seem to exist side by side. On one side, the barefoot masses, families struggling in the heat, surviving on little, walking the dusty streets of Manila in worn-out sandals. On the other, behind the gates of Malacañang Palace, a world of glittering chandeliers, velvet carpets, and the soft echo of high heels on marble floors. Inside the palace lay one of history's strangest symbols of power, shoes. Not dozens, not hundreds, but thousands of pairs. Italian leather, Parisian silk, New York luxury, some decorated with jewels, others handmade by master craftsmen. Each was carefully chosen by Imelda Marcos, First Lady of the Philippines, who saw them not as simple footwear, but as treasures, trophies, and symbols of beauty. To Imelda, her shoes reflected the nation's dignity. To the people outside, they became symbols of inequality. While mothers cradled hungry children and men struggled to find work, the palace storerooms overflowed with unused shoes stacked in silent towers of extravagance. But Imelda's hunger for grandeur could not be contained by fashion. In the late 1960s, she envisioned something greater, a monument that would outlive her, something built not of silk or diamonds, but of stone and concrete. She called it the Cultural Center of the Philippines. The plan was ambitious, almost audacious. Rising on reclaimed land from Manila Bay, the center was meant to be a beacon of art, music, and theater. It was her way of telling the world that the Philippines was not a nation of poverty, but of sophistication. Construction began under impossible deadlines. Thousands of workers labored day and night. Some whispered that when workers died on site, their bodies were buried beneath the wet concrete, hidden forever in the foundation. Whether true or myth, the story clung to the building like a ghost. When the Cultural Center opened in 1969, world dignitaries and elites filled its grand halls. Imelda, dressed in a gown that shimmered under the lights, welcomed them as though she were an empress. For her, it was triumph. For the people, it was proof of misplaced priorities. Millions spent on marble theaters while many Filipinos lacked bread. The center became, like the shoes, a monument not only to culture but to excess, obsession, and the painful cost of power. And then came 1986. The winds of change roared across the archipelago. The people power revolution had begun. Millions of Filipinos flooded the streets, chanting for the end of the Marcos regime. Outside Malacañang, the crowd grew louder, their voices shaking the palace gates. Inside, fear replaced music. Soldiers whispered in corridors, generals weighed their loyalty, advisors argued over desperate plans. The once mighty palace had become a cage of uncertainty. Boxes were packed in haste, paintings, jewelry, foreign cash. But even in this chaos, Imelda did not abandon her performance. Before a mirror, she adjusted her makeup, applied lipstick, and clasped a pearl necklace around her throat. To her, even exile had to look graceful. Helicopters thundered above the palace roof. Arrangements had been made. American forces would escort the Marcos family into exile. In the night's confusion, Ferdinand, Imelda, and their children were rushed aboard, carrying suitcases stuffed with treasures. The palace doors shut behind them forever. At dawn, the people stormed Malacañang. What they found stunned the world. Golden faucets, crystal chandeliers still glowing, banquets half-eaten, closets overflowing with gowns. And then, the shoes, endless rows of them, lined up in silent mockery of the hunger outside. Cameras captured the scene, and within days, the image of Imelda's shoes had circled the globe. They became not just a collection, but a symbol. Extravagance crystallized into history. Today, many of those shoes rest in a museum, carefully preserved behind glass. Tourists walk among them in disbelief. Some shake their heads, others laugh nervously, all aware they are looking at more than fashion. In every polished heel and jeweled sandal lies the memory of a fallen palace, a nation betrayed, and a people who found their voice. The Cultural Center still stands as well, hosting concerts and plays. Yet its walls carry whispers of what it cost to build, reminders that monuments to vanity cannot silence the truth. And the palace remains a symbol too, not of power, but of how quickly power can crumble. Imelda Marcos's obsession with grandeur left behind many relics, shoes, palaces, theaters of stone. But none of them outlasted the revolution of 1986. For in the end, no amount of silk or marble could hide the truth. Power without humility will always collapse under the weight of its own illusions. The shoes, the palace, the center of culture, all still stand. But today, they do not tell the story of glory. They tell the story of downfall. It began with a promise. In 1965, Ferdinand Marcos stood before the Filipino people and declared a new era of prosperity. He spoke of progress, discipline, and a nation rising into greatness. At his side was Imelda, radiant and magnetic, whose beauty and grace turned every political stage into a theater. Together, they looked unstoppable. He, the strategist, she, the symbol. For a time, many believed. Roads were built, projects launched, slogans repeated. But beneath the surface, ambition was eating away at the promise. Power became concentrated in the hands of one man and one family. Corruption seeped into government offices. Contracts, favors, and fortunes flowed not to the people, but to those loyal to the palace. Then came 1972. Under the pretense of protecting the nation from chaos and rebellion, Ferdinand declared martial law. Overnight, freedom disappeared. Soldiers marched in the streets, opposition leaders were rounded up, newspapers silenced, curfews fell across the islands. For millions of Filipinos, fear became part of daily life. Among those arrested was Senator Benigno, Ninoy Aquino, the most vocal critic of Marcos. His imprisonment sent a chilling message. Dissent would not be tolerated. For years, Ninoy languished in a cell, his words smuggled out on scraps of paper, keeping alive the flame of resistance. Eventually exiled to the United States, he could have chosen silence and safety. But his heart remained with his people. Meanwhile, inside Malacañang Palace, Imelda grew in influence. She was no longer just the president's wife. She was a queen in all but name. She built palaces, hospitals, and theaters that bore her mark. She traveled abroad, mingling with kings and presidents, projecting the image of a Philippines wrapped in elegance. Yet behind the gowns and jewels, resentment brewed. For every chandelier in the palace, there were thousands of homes without electricity. For every banquet she hosted, countless Filipinos went to bed hungry. In 1983, Ninoy Aquino made his fateful decision. Despite warnings, he returned to Manila, believing that his presence could unite the opposition. As he stepped off the plane, gunshots echoed. Ninoy fell, his blood staining the tarmac. His assassination was not the end of his story, it was the beginning of a revolution. The nation erupted, protests multiplied, anger surged, and the church took a stand. Cardinal Jaime Sin called on the people to protect defecting soldiers who had turned against Marcos, and the people answered. By the millions, they poured into the streets of Manila in February 1986. Housewives carried rosaries, priests and nuns linked arms in prayer, children climbed tanks draped in flowers. It was not an army that faced the dictator, it was a nation, unarmed yet unstoppable. Inside Malacañang, panic spread. Ferdinand tried to cling to power, broadcasting defiance on television, while Imelda, ever the performer, prepared herself as though for another gala. But the tide had turned. Even the military split, with generals defecting to the side of the people. On February 25th, 2 ceremonies took place. In one, Ferdinand Marcos declared himself victor of a fraudulent election. In the other, Corazon Aquino, widow of Ninoy, was sworn in as the true president. The world watched, and history made its choice. That night, helicopters descended onto the palace grounds. In the dark, the Marcos family was rushed aboard, carrying suitcases stuffed with treasures. Within hours, they were flown to exile in Hawaii. The palace, once untouchable, lay abandoned. At dawn, the people entered Malacañang. What they found stunned them. Gold bars stacked like bricks, paintings torn from museum walls, closets bursting with gowns, and thousands of pairs of shoes. The image of those shoes raced across the globe, forever branding the Marcos era as one of Avenue